Good evening, everybody. This is the Collective Objective. I'm Justin. Tonight I'm with Destiny and Sammy. Sticking with the Pride theme, tonight we're going to discuss the Equality Act. And I'll kind of just do a brief summary of what the Equality Act is, and then we'll discuss it. But first, let's do some introductions. I am Justin. I'm a pretty chill guy, I guess, and I don't know where I lie on the political spectrum, but it's somewhere on the left. With that, I guess we'll just go clockwise. Destiny.
All right, I'm Destiny. I'm pretty far left politically, pansexual, so LGBTQ is very important to me. The Equality Act, very important, so I'm glad that we're having this discussion tonight.
Awesome.
Hi, I'm Sammy. I use they, them pronouns. I identify as genderqueer. And I would say that if I were to identify myself in an international level, I would consider myself a social democrat, which is probably somewhere in between what like a socialist and like a traditional American Democrat is.
Awesome. Thank you. So the Equality Act, my understanding of it is basically an expansion of the Civil Rights Act. And Sammy, you can get all poli-sci nerdy when we kind of dissect it a little bit. My understanding is it's an expansion of the Civil Rights Act to include no discrimination against gender identity or sexual orientation. It's passed the House. I don't think it's passed the Senate yet. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And I'm sure President Biden will sign it once it does. So it's just a matter of time. I imagine it will pass the Senate. So it's just a matter of time before that's the law.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a very optimistic outlook, Justin.
Maybe I'm a little too optimistic. The reason why I think that it will pass the Senate is because it is in Democratic control. I know that there's a couple.
That's a filibuster. That's a filibuster prevented bill, actually.
Is it? Well,
Republicans.
That's another conversation that we need to have, is ending the filibuster. But we'll save that for another time. So. What does the Equality Act mean to y'all, being LGBTIQ?
It's just, it would stop people, against trans people, the bills that they're trying to pass for like sports and bathrooms, and that's important. And something that should be noted is if you read a lot of these bills, they specifically are going for transgender women. In the wording of these bills, they're not going after transgender men. So why is that there is such a fear of transgender women, but there seems to be no issue with a transgender man?
It's archaic thinking, I think. Having illegitimate fear that pedophiles are somehow disguising themselves as transgender so that they can get in the bathroom, but I don't think that's a legitimate fear. I think it's bullshit. But
and just to speak to that, my thing with that is I don't think that I'm gonna be like edgy trans person, but like that's propaganda. To be like
absolutely
point blank, like period, that is propaganda. That people, hi Kimberly, it's propaganda that people are using in order to create fear, because reasonable people would not. There are several things within that argument that are really problematic. So one is that it's already illegal for men to do those things. So if a man was pretending to be transgender to do that and he would still be treated the same, and no one's doing anything to stop men from doing that now.
Yep, absolutely.
So it just doesn't make sense. It's a false argument that's put up as a front to make people seem not bigoted for the actual problem that they have with
Here we keep-
actual trans people going to the bathroom or having access to locker women. Trans women with, there is people don't want to talk about trans men in these conversations because it's hard to make the same argument because they're making an argument with a false basis in feminism that they never respected in the first place. And they can't make that same argument with trans men because trans men in that same line of thinking would be more vulnerable. But the reality is that are the ones that are at risk of being attacked in a bathroom. So that's what I think about that.
And the sports argument too is that's the other one that they like to go to is the we can't allow transgender women playing sports, which I think is bullshit.
Well, and let's talk about that, right? So how many women winning
It's few
a prize in a sport?
Yeah, it's
few and far between, because it's already few and far between that trans women are participating in sports, much less winning. The reality is that women and trans women, the only big difference between people who are assigned male at birth and people who are assigned female at birth playing sports is the skeletal advantage. And I'm saying this completely from the perspective of like having had conversations with people who study exercise science and teach exercise science at universities. So I'm not like making this up off of no basis. The major difference in sports between people who are assigned male at birth and female at birth is a skeletal advantage, because typically people who are assigned male, let's keep that in mind, this is an average, we're not talking about all people, which is a whole other element to the argument that we'll bring in a second. Typically, people who are assigned male at birth have a longer skeleton than people who are assigned female at birth. That's true. About everything else is very subjective, right? So there are people who are assigned female at birth that are way more muscular than even your average person who is assigned at birth. And that's a reality. Where that's also all without taking into account the fact that trans people are typically, when participating in sports in an inclusive fashion, required to take hormones before they switch the gender they play with, which also affects these kinds of things.
Absolutely.
Muscular development in trans women changes completely after on hormones. And all of this is going without keeping in mind that women's bodies and men's bodies vary greatly within just cisgender people. So like if you look at a cisgender woman who is very muscular and built compared to a cisgender man who has a more petite frame, the cisgender woman is probably going to perform better in a sport that requires muscle.
Right.
And that's just like the reality. It's there's so much variance in the human body that we can't assume that these blanket statements that we are applying to men or women apply to each individual. And that's why barring trans people altogether from a sport just doesn't make sense. All three of these things add up to this argument making no sense. The reality is that each person under the current inclusive systems that we have, each person is evaluated to see if they qualify to play with the other gender than they had previously played with. So it just doesn't, like, to me, there is no line of logic that makes sense because the data doesn't support the argument that trans people should not be playing with cisgender people.
One thing that I think is kind of funny about the whole thing is conservatives are typically the less government. We want less government in our life, and now that they're wanting to overregulate gender, they're wanting to overregulate abortion. So it's they're selective with how they want their government in their life, I guess is the point I'm trying to make.
Well, let's be real. Let's be real right now. Under the Republican Party, the government has only grown.
Yeah.
Has only grown. Like, who created the Department of Homeland Security? Who created ICE? Who created, like, the vast majority of administrative departments that have been created within the last 10 years have been created by Republicans, because it's not really about the size of the government. It's about the size of the government in areas that are not my priority.
Right.
So Republicans have an issue with the government growing in areas that make them bothered, right? So, like, it's a problem if we start taxing churches that get involved with politics, but it's not a problem if we kick people out of the country and create hundreds of prisons that are unregulated and put children in them on government funds. And, like, the thing that really irks me about that is also that privatized, like, government systems that are still funded by the government is still big government. It's just unregulated big government, which is scarier, because basically what you're saying is the government can pay people who we don't know what they're going to do and can barely hold accountable for what they're going to do things to other people. And then they give all this money. You want to talk about big government? I am not against funding our defense system, but the disproportionate rate at which we fund our defense system is very clear that it's a priority to Republicans to overfund our defense system to the point where it is infeasible for a country to think about coming up against the United States alone. It's just not possible. And even if we cut that budget, it would still be unfeasible. I think, we can maintain that idea without putting our entire budget into the military and police.
I mean, if we cut the budget of our military and our police by a third, we could fund a lot of other programs that we could actually do a lot more.
Well, I don't even think that's the argument anyone is making either. No one's asking for them to be cut by a third. And it's all at the expense of our citizens' well-being. That's correct, Kimberly. 100% correct. I think, that's where we can kind of round back to the Equality Act, right? There are people who are going to argue that this is going to cause litigation and that this is making bigger government because there's going to have to be people who enforce the Equality Act, like as if there isn't already a group of people who enforce the rest of the Civil Rights Act. Let's be real. These are all excuses to deny people basic human. And I really want to talk about why the Equality Act is necessary, because I think a lot of people don't get the big picture. A lot of people think, most people support the LGBT community. It's most people in the and it's true, most people in the United States support the LGBTQ community at this point. Most people in the United States do have positive attitudes towards LGBTQ people, and therefore people think that nothing has to be done, and that's simply not true. So There are some topics. I've really worked in this field within Florida in particular. The Florida Competitive Workforce Act is very similar to the Equality Act, just at the state level in Florida. So there's three levels of protection that we have in any civil rights legislation at either the state or federal level, right? There is protection from discrimination in the workplace, protections from discrimination in housing, and protections from discrimination in public accommodations. And those are three different things. And each of those things is very vital to very specific parts of the LGBTQ community. So, for example, let's look at housing, right? A really good example of housing is when we talk about the community of LGBTQ elders, the people who have fought for so many years for the rights of LGBTQ people and done things like secure the right to marry, and secure the right to serve in our military and things like that, right? Those are some pretty big things that have come up. And what a lot of people don't think about is that now that a lot of these LGBTQ elders are entering our assisted living facilities, our into independent living facilities, that a lot of these facilities have not adjusted to accommodate LGBTQ people, and they won't, and legally do not have to put same-sex couples together, house trans people with the appropriate gender, and can discriminate against people who are living in those facilities for having a picture of a loved one who is LGBTQ. And all of this is not illegal in much of the United States. There are parts of the United States where it is illegal because it's illegal at the state level. But it's not right that people in Washington have protections against that, but people in Florida do not. 40% of Floridians can legally be kicked out of their home if their landlord finds out that they are living with a partner of the same sex. And I think that's a pretty stark number. And now if you look at this map, all of the gray states have no protections in their state law on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. There are some of those states, like in Florida right now, they have decided to include on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity for specific forms of discrimination. Not all three, but specific forms of discrimination, right? So there are ways that people are kind of swinging that and changing that and trying to work around it. But the reality is, if the Equality Act is passed, none of this has to happen anymore. No one has to bend around the law or wait for a judge to decide. All of it comes into place. And I really hate to see LGBTQ elders not have a place to live, or be kicked out of their place of living, or for LGBTQ youth to be homeless and unable to find a home when they get the means to have one. But that's the reality of many American LGBTQ people. I mean, you saw that map. That's most of the country.
Yep.
By a long shot. Now,
let's see really quick. I'll just count up the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So it's about 20 states that
not even half. Not even half. So a majority of the country. It's really wild, I think. And then that's just part of it. If you want to talk about public accommodations, Can you imagine going into a restaurant with someone you love and sitting down to have dinner together and then refusing to be served, and you are told outright by the person who is supposed to be serving you that you are not welcome there and you have to leave? That's illegal in a huge swath of the country.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not just that, you know, like trans people, if they want to just use, you know, how poorly protected LGBTQ Americans are. I lived in a county in Florida that had a local protection for LGBTQ people. So if I was kicked out of a bathroom for just going pee, and no one's going to say to me that I'm going in there to sexually harass women and girls, because I'm not. and anyone who knows me knows that, right? So they're not going to say that to me. And if I go into the restroom in Orange County and someone kicks me out of an establishment for trying to use the restroom that I feel comfortable in, which is typically the women's restroom, I could sue them and hold them accountable. I mean, north of where I used to live in Florida, and I did not, and the same thing happened. Simply unjust, right? Like, just two forms of public open to the public and do not hold a sincerely held religious belief, have to serve the public and accommodate them. So if a business is not operated by a majority of people with a specific to serve everyone who comes into their doors, if they have the money, they serve them. And if they discriminate based on protected categories, and then the other kind of accommodations, like everyone has equal access to the restroom. You either let all customers use it or no customers use it. If you do not allow trans customers to use your restroom, then you cannot let cisgender people use your restroom who are customers. That would be what the Equality Act would do nationally. And that would end the, if I went from Washington to Idaho, or if I went from Orange County to Seminole County in Florida, or if I, you know, like it's just endless, like back and forth. And it's really come to a head where like LGBTQ people have to choose where they can travel, where they can live, where they can exist in public, based off of what states decide
Or cities.
LGBTQ people are allowed, like, and cities even, because in some states, you know, if a state doesn't have that protection at the state level, then you have to go between cities, counties, different municipalities. So that's exactly, it's extremely limiting. It makes, and when you think about the fact that LGBTQ people, like, for example, there's a lot of people talk about the pink tax. The pink tax is a form of utilizing the income of women in ways that it does not have to be used for men. So like a pink razor that's marketed for women costs more money than a blue razor that's marketed for men. And that's a fact. Like there's no denying that. The data shows it, right? Trans people are also taxed for being trans. They are forced to pay exorbitant amount of money to go through medical services and psychiatric and psychological services that allow them to exist in a world that excludes them. And it's and honestly, there's a tax against the community of people they're not straight, because they are expected to do more forms, like there's just like more red tape around same-sex couples, and it's just like a number of things. Like you have to pay more money to get a cake topper that is the same-sex couple cake topper, or you have to pay to get your name changed if you are trans. Different things like that, or like I have to pay to get an ID with my name changed and my gender correct on just on my government ID. And there's all these kinds of things that people don't think about that the Equality Act would force us to reconsider how it's run.
Yeah, and to touch on that, documents, so many documents. How many times do you have to check your gender? But there's only 2 on there.
Yep.
And there's so many documents that you sign throughout your life, and you have to pick one or the other. Well, how is that fair to
It's getting better.
non-binary?
It is getting a little bit better. Like I recently filled out some job applications, and there is a third option, but it's just
But
not
that's
specific.
because a private entity decided to do that.
Yes.
Right.
On government forms, it's even less likely that that's the case. There are some progressive states like Washington that like have those inclusive options on their forms, but even that becomes a red tape because you have to have evidence that's your gender. And in order to prove that you are transgender, you have to go through like visiting a doctor, getting that doctor to sign a note, and documenting all these different things. Depending on the state you're in, sometimes it's more lenient, sometimes it's more difficult. And that can be an issue. And that third option also allows for discrimination, you're correct.
Very true.
So, but you also don't have to disclose your gender on a job application. That's illegal for people to force you to do. But one of the things that I wanted to note too is that a really good example of this at the federal level that would change is that the things you often have to do is fill out a form for the EEOC opportunity. So it's an acronym. Oh my gosh, I forget. It's a fancy word for like it's the Equal Employment Opportunity Credit. So what it is, it's a tax credit that gets given to businesses that have diversity. And one of those includes gender, because they want to make sure that women are getting hired by companies that want a tax break, so that, or men in fields that are traditionally not inclusive to men, right? So it's basically if you increase your diversity in gender, you get a tax credit. But the only options for that are male and female. So every time I get a new job with a large company, I have to fill out that form. And so it's just different things like that, right? And so you'll see like all of these things kind of stack up that can change. And that all has to do with accommodations, right? Because the government is required to accommodate everyone if we make it the case that sexual orientation and gender identity have to be publicly accommodated. That also means that the government has to be inclusive.
The company that I used to work for was a German company, so they're pretty progressive. And in our email signature, they had us put our pronouns, which I thought was pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah,
I think that needs to become like just like common, like the norm, that you can list your pronouns so that people know the correct pronouns to talk to people.
And also, I guess the third tier I wanted to talk about was employment discrimination. And this is one of the more egregious things. I believe that actually has been covered by a Supreme Court case, but it's very limited in its scope. So the employment discrimination involved, but essentially, and it has to be solved through litigation. So it's less proactive than it would be if it was a law, right? If it's a law, it becomes a proactive issue and it stops being a reactive issue. Since it was based off of a court case decision right now, the only way to resolve employment discrimination is by reaction. So if someone is discriminated against in employment, that can include education toward the workplace when it becomes legislation. So that means that we create materials that teach employers how to treat LGBTQ employees correctly and make them feel comfortable in the workplace. And that would be provided by the government. And you can see that in all kinds of things that are about diversity and inclusion, like race, sex, age, national origin. There's all kinds of materials from the government to help with things like that so that people don't break the law because they don't want you to. And with employment discrimination in particular, it has been pretty egregious. There are companies that won't hire people based off of morality clauses that force people to not be LGBTQ in non-religious companies. And, you know, I for one, find the religious freedom argument a little troubling because I think that if someone wants to operate in the public sphere, they have to serve the entire public. And if they don't want to operate in the public sphere, then they need to become a religious organization, not a for-profit business. But that's my 2 cents. But keeping back to the law, there's been really bad cases of employment discrimination, such to the point that it did get taken to the Supreme Court. People get mistreated when their bosses find out that they are transitioning or have transitioned. People get mistreated when they see a photo of a loved one, like a partner or a trans child or a bisexual daughter who is with their same-sex partner or anything like that. If someone sees a photo of someone like that on someone's desk, the next thing you know, they get treated different in the workplace. Their coworkers start harassing them, their boss starts harassing them, there's retaliation, all these things that would be illegal if it were someone's gender or race or age or disability or another form of protected class. And so all of these things are really like, they affect the daily life of LGBTQ people so much. Like, could you imagine if you couldn't get a job because you got discriminated against in every interview process? You couldn't find a home because you got discriminated against in every rental application process. You couldn't find a bathroom to go pee in because businesses could just kick you out.
Or somewhere to eat if you just want to
Or
go
somewhere
out.
to eat if you want to go out to eat because you don't have a house and you don't have a job and you manage to scrounge together some money and you want to go to the 7-Eleven and get something and you get kicked out. This can affect people really poorly. And there's a really, and if people want to know why there's such a high rate of suicidal ideation, if there's and a high rate of successful suicide attempts, if people want to know why there's such a high rate of LGBTQ poverty, of LGBTQ homelessness, especially among youth and people of color, why it's so easy for Black trans women to be targeted and therefore Black trans women are killed at a higher rate because they have compounding oppressions. This is why. This is why this is all the case, because nationally we have refused up to this point to give LGBTQ people the same protections we give other protected classes.
I mean, even on social media, how many times do you see people, going after members of the LGBTQ and nothing happens?
Yeah, and doxing them and harassing them
Yep.
for being who they are. Now, this would have to be another. I do not believe that the Equality Act includes hate crimes, but I believe there was also a hate crimes bill that was passed through the House. I could be wrong, and I don't remember its name. I know there's been one, but it's that would be another issue that's really important, is addressing hate crimes such as cyberbullying, and other parts of doxing that would be considered illegal. Any kind of discrimination that would be more personal wouldn't be covered under the Equality Act, because the Equality Act is more about the societal part of it. It's more about those 3 levels of discrimination. So employment, housing, and public accommodations. And those are some pretty basic things. Like, that's what people need to live. Like, it's not that hard. People need a place to eat and pee. People need a place to sleep, and people need a place to make money so that they can do those 2 other things. I don't think that's asking much. Like,
it's really not asking, and really it just comes down to being like just being decent, and I don't know, I'm trying to say, like, just having like common decency for the people you share your society with, like, and it's sad that in the 21st century we're still having to like just get people to get there, to be decent human beings and be respectful of other people. But if people were just decent and respectful to one another, we wouldn't need these laws.
But they're not.
They're not.
But they're not.
A good example I have is, I remember when I started working at a drugstore in my hometown, and I really liked this one girl that I was working with, and everybody started warning me, well, she's a lesbian, be careful. And I'm sitting there like, why does that matter at all? That made me want to be friends with her more, because it's like, I'm not going to judge a person by who they love. And it got to the point where, I caught people like saying horrible things. Like, there was one guy that I worked with, he got fired because of what he said. He said the only reason she's a lesbian is because she can never get a man. And I reported it, and several others reported it. And it's like, no, that's not going to fly here. So, but that's just like their daily life. They have to face that daily.
And there's areas of the country where it's a lot easier, like the states that already have the protections, like a lot of the Pacific Northwest and a lot of the West Coast and the Northeast has those protections. But there's parts of the country, like the Deep South, where it is extremely hard to be LGBTIQA and a person of color. Still, even with the protections, even with the Civil Rights Act, it's still it's really like in like rural Alabama, rural Georgia, Mississippi.
Shoot, in Florida. Like, a lot of people think that, like, that's what a lot of people think of. They're like, oh, Alabama, Mississippi. No, it's hard in Iowa. It's hard in Florida. It's hard in, like, I'm pretty sure that, I don't want to say this definitively, but does Arizona have protections?
No, they don't.
Yeah, Arizona. Like that. The people think of Arizona as West Coast. They don't have those protections.
Or even in cities, like in my town, do you think I would fly my pansexual flag outside? Probably not, because I know there's way too many Trump supporters and conservatives and closed-minded people that would rip that down or damage our house or worse, just
Where
for flying a flag.
where I live, I couldn't even put a Biden sign outside, let alone a pride flag or something like that. It's horrible.
And I can't understand that. Why are you going? It's somebody else's property. Why do you care so much if they have a pride flag on the front of their house, or if they paint their entire house rainbow pride colors? Who cares? It's their house.
And supposedly they want you to have, those freedoms within your home and your private property, but like we said earlier, it's very selective.
And a lot of these same Trump cultists who their entire identity is Trump, Trump, Trump. But then the second an LGBTQ person comes along, they're like, stop using your identity to your sexual identity and lifestyle to be your entire life. And it's like, what are you talking about? I mean, you have Trump like all over your house and you talk about only Trump all the time. That's a little hypocritical. They don't like getting called out on that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's true.
So Sammy, you don't think that it's going to pass the Senate?
No. Can you name 10 Republicans who would pass it?
No.
Yeah. As much as I would love for that to be the case, it's not going to happen. Maybe Mitt Romney, because he's from Massachusetts. Maybe. And that's a big maybe.
Oh, and then you have,
and it's not, and he represents Utah, but Utah actually, I think, recently passed these kinds of protections, so it would be favorable for him to do that.
Yep, they did.
Yeah.
I just looked.
Well, and we have problematic people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Boebert, that they're going to fight that hard, and for whatever reason they are so against it, and so they're going to scream the loudest.
They don't have a say in the Senate passing it. But they will scream and holler about it. I will say that. But I think that's one thing that pretty much most of the Senate Republicans are and faith in the bipartisanship of even the most bipartisan Republicans in the Senate for things like that.
Who else I could see pass it is Rand Paul, because he's a libertarian. So maybe.
Maybe.
Big maybe. I'm looking at the senators now. Rick Scott definitely won't.
Oh God, don't even get me started on Florida. Even though Florida is the third largest, the state with the third largest portion of LGBTQ people in its population in the country. Lindsey
Graham might support it. There's
Lady G.
allegedly he is Lady G.
Lady G. No, that's not gonna happen. He wouldn't vote for that. Not public.
No, I was joking. I don't think he would.
Not when it's public record. So I was like, do you love that I immediately knew what you were talking about? Yeah. So yes, exactly. This is the most important thing about this conversation, is that we have to remember that we have to vote. We have to advocate. We have to educate, especially if you are an ally. Like, it's a huge thing for you to educate. Like, I'm taking my time to do this. And because I want people to have this information, and I'm doing it on a pretty public platform so I can get it out to as many people as possible. But like, I can't do that for each and every person that I meet. And it's really emotionally taxing on me sometimes, because these are things that personally affect me, So if you're an ally, consider that, and consider really getting your facts together and using this broader narrative that I have shared alongside data to help people gain that kind of empathy. I really like to share it from a story perspective because people get that better. Numbers don't always convince people on matters of social justice. It really comes down to stories, like
you gotta get their emotions.
yeah, because it's real people who are experiencing real things, and people need to get that. Talking about numbers doesn't feel human, and
You're
these are
adding
human
humanity.
issues.
You're adding the humanity to the issue, and hopefully you would hope that some people have empathy and that then they can kind of relate.
What I will say is I think most people have empathy. I won't say everyone, but most people will have empathy toward that. And I think that's what we've been working really hard on as LGBTQ advocates. But the really big thing is we have to remember to vote. We have to remember to advocate and educate. Pressure your legislators, Florida has one of the biggest LGBTQ populations in the country.
Yeah,
if
absolutely.
all of the LGBTQ people were politically active in Florida and got together and put pressure on Rick Scott and Marco Rubio, you bet their butts they would be voting for the Equality Act.
I don't know if those two would, to be honest.
Marco might. He's kind of a chicken. But it would actually have to be like every single LGBTQ person would have to actually put actual pressure on them, and I don't see that happening. But because the reality, I'm all for it. I work with people to get people to do that, right? When I was in Florida, suddenly see the tides turning and a vast majority of LGBTQ people being politically active on that issue. Because they have everyday lives that they have to do, right? And so they don't feel like they have the time to do that. And it's exhausting. And so and especially when you have people like Marco Rubio and Rick Scott telling you no all the time, it can be. I really don't think people have the energy to do that. So I just don't see that happening anytime soon. So what's more important is replacing Marco Rubio because he's up for election.
Yep.
What's more important is getting people who we can convince, right? So I don't think this will be an issue for Kristen Sinema because she's bisexual. I don't think this is going to be an issue for Joe Manchin, right? These are issues that Democrats pretty much rally around, right? At least at the federal level. I won't say that they do at the local level because that's not true. But at the federal level, supporting the LGBTQ community has brought Democrats together. And especially the Senate Democrats. What I think we really need to do is put pressure on moderate Republicans, put pressure on people to vote and change the composition of the Senate, put pressure on Joe, because both of them need to support. Because if not,
I will say that if the last election's any indicator,
it's going to be hard.
It is. But I think the tides are turning. The fact that two Democratic senators won Georgia is a huge deal. That's a huge deal.
If other states do that work, which that's the question, right? What I will say is that we are in quite a unique time. If we look at the trends, most of the time, after a new president takes the White House from a new party, if they have a majority in the House and the Senate, it is highly likely that they will lose at least one chamber of the Congress.
Yeah.
Maybe both.
Usually at midterms, you're right.
At the midterms. That's just the trend. However, that also coincides with a lot of other data. For example, typically within the first 2 years, which we're pretty much through we're halfway through the first one, and Biden's already doing better than Obama did and Clinton did in their numbers, right? And so if we look at this trend, Biden's still above 50% in favorability. And every president that's had this trend where like the government like switches to the other side in at least one chamber of the government after they've been elected, their electability has dropped considerably. And Biden's has remained steady to this point. So if that trend continues, it's likely that momentum for Democrats will continue. And the nice part too is a lot of the seats that are up for re-election are Republicans. So
one thing that I do like about Biden is he's kind of a in the center,
which is good for a president.
It is good. And we're starting to see the right go far right, and I think that is going to turn a lot of people off.
I have lots of thoughts on that, but I think he's helping us there.
Yeah, I mean he's not far left.
I can say also
for my liking, but I'll accept it.
Don't get me started.
Better than the alternative.
I sorry. I've been talking a lot today. And my voice box just got really dry. Yay, allergies. One of the other things that we have to really consider is how are we building that momentum like they did in Georgia?
I mean, that was a grassroots campaign.
Mm-hmm. 2 grassroots campaigns running at the same time in the same state, which is unheard of because that almost never happens.
I will say that
that's for sure.
In the runoff, there was a lot of money that went into that election. Mm-hmm. So that wasn't as grassroots, but
I've done a lot of research into what happened in Georgia, and it was very grassroots. Like all of the things that progressives complained about happening in Florida were not being done in Georgia. And we're typically, I'm going to be honest, like as someone who works campaign side, like the people who run campaigns on the like field level tend to be more progressive. And so like we notice certain trends that the people who have the money don't really care about sometimes. And so, for example, I read this really powerful article after the election in Georgia that was talking about how in the counties that surround Atlanta that swung Georgia blue,
6 million people.
6 million people, literally 6 million people. A huge part of that was that apartment communities where people of color were moving into Atlanta, particularly Latinx people and immigrants who now had the right to vote after having gone through the citizenship process, and people of color who have been historically shut out of the process who have been around. Or renters or people who are low income, all people who are likely to vote Democrat, right, are typically live in apartments when they first moved to the area. And so there was a volunteer who decided that she was going to register people to vote, build relationships with people, and regularly visit these people to make sure that they were ready to vote and going to vote for the election. And she got other people doing the same thing. And so people were going to apartment complexes, knocking door to door, talking to everyone, and getting as many people as they could. registered to vote, making sure that they got their ballots and that they filled them out and got them in. And that's
they're trying. So a lot of what happened in Georgia too was there before this election. There's a lot of voter suppression that happened, and it happened to Stacey Abrams when she was running for governor, and she so happened to be running against the Secretary of State at the time, who runs the election for Georgia. That's not shady at all, but she took that and she said it's not going to happen again. We're not going to allow voter suppression in our state. But now you have the Georgia state legislature trying to overturn a lot of the work that she's done and allow that voter suppression to happen again.
So and that's why we need to pass the For the People Act.
Yeah.
Which I could get into the difference. I really don't want to get into that right now, but there's two pieces of legislation that are voter protection legislation bills that are in the Senate right now. There's S1, which is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act is fairly limited compared to the For the People Act. The For the People Act ensures that as many people who are qualified to vote are able to vote. And creates basic democratic guidelines that the United States has encouraged in other countries for decades, but not here. So, I have some thoughts.
We almost have Texas though, and once that happens, it's all over. Game over. Once Texas goes blue, it's over.
Well, I don't know. The trends in 2020 were not promising with Texas.
I think something shady is going on there because if you look at the metropolitan areas, which hold majority of the population in Texas, they're all starting to turn blue. I think something fishy happened in Florida too.
Oh, plenty fishy. Don't even get me started. But also in Florida, don't get me started. I'm gonna get mad. I was working on that election. A lot of that was not on the side of the Republicans as much as I want to say it was. It was how people spent money and what people did with that money. So, at least in Florida. So,
something I wanted to bring up, I think it was it Utah that passed that they're going to have LGBTQ history in their curriculum now? I think it was Utah.
Okay, Utah, go off.
There was a state that recently passed that they're going to have that in their curriculum, that the LGBTQ history and education on that. So,
Kimberly, there was a fake candidate in a Florida race.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a really interesting thing if you want to get a little sidetracked. There was a pro LGBTQ candidate. I don't remember if he is LGBTQ, but he was at least pro LGBTQ candidate who was a strong Democrat in South Florida. And he was endorsed by all kinds of organizations, very, very Democrat, and in a very Democratic area. And his name is Jose Javier Rodriguez. And there was a ran against him, and she won the election. But the fun part about that is that they recruited someone to run as an independent who had the same last name as him. And sent out confusing advertisements and did shady fundraising to make sure that election and utilized they basically made him up. He wasn't it was a whole thing. They made him up, and they essentially used him to confuse people and get them to vote for someone who didn't exist using campaign funds, which is illegal in the state of Florida. Used someone who didn't exist, and got enough votes to turn the election. Like, if all those people had voted for Jose Javier Rodriguez, he would have won.
Wow.
It's a lot of shadies in Florida. So, but there's all kinds of other stuff I could go off about, like how South Florida misappropriated a lot of funds that should have been used to court the Latinx vote and did not get done correctly, and that Miami-Dade significantly dropped in Democratic support because the Republicans.
I will say this: there was
correctly.
There was a lot of fear mongering that went on with the last election with the Latinx community.
They used anti-socialist propaganda, right?
Yeah.
Even though Biden is clearly not a socialist.
Yeah.
So, but it wasn't just that. It was that essentially in South Florida, like, if you want to hear my tea, let's hear the tea. So in South Florida, essentially, after Bloomberg dropped out, he invested a ton of money in South Florida and essentially took over the campaign machine in South Florida, not Central or North Florida, but South Florida. And so, because they were underfunded. And so a lot of shady things started happening. There weren't things were not being properly translated into Spanish. Materials were not being provided that were being provided in English and Spanish. In a real really Latinx county. Like, I'm talking about the most Latinx county in Florida that is the most vital for Florida to go blue, right? Like, if Miami does not go like full blue,
there's no chance.
We don't win an election. Like, there's no chance. So the fact that the numbers dropped at the rate that they did, and I know campaign stories of like people fighting employees who speak Spanish and people fighting for a translation of materials being produced by the FTP and it being ignored. Just lots of misappropriations of funds, lots of consultants not knowing what they're doing. The same consultants who do every election in Florida. I wonder why we haven't had a Democratic governor in over 20 years. It's a lot of that kind of stuff. And so there's a lot of corruption on both sides of the aisle in Florida. And it's created a problem. But, it's not just, to spin it back around, a lot of that stuff affects the LGBTQ community. In Florida, Ron DeSantis just signed legislation during Pride Month. Let's put this out there. During Pride Month, Ron DeSantis signed legislation to kick trans girls, specifically trans girls, out of sports.
Yep.
To banned racial critical theory, which affects trans women of color who are murdered at an exponential rate in Florida.
Yep. He removed it from all the curriculums.
Yeah, which is funny because they don't even really teach that in most K through 12 curriculums, but it's fine. Let's create problems that aren't really happening. Hi, Florida GOP.
It's a dog whistle.
Yeah.
For the people on the right.
Also, and then also he vetoed a bill that would have funded mental health services for Pulse victims
Yep.
and the people who saved them.
After when it all happened and he showed up and cried his tears and showed his support, and then he turns around and does this.
Rick Scott, but still.
DeSantis
And-
scares me more than Trump. I'm gonna be scared. I'm gonna be like 100% honest. Like, he scares me more than Trump because Trump. It's clear like he's not smart. It's clear he's an idiot. DeSantis, he's got a way about speaking and presenting his case that I feel like would resonate with more people than what Trump was doing, and that scares me. He's not an idiot. Like, Trump's an idiot. DeSantis isn't an idiot. Like, I don't agree with anything that he's doing, but he's smart. He's a smart lunatic.
It's but I guess one thing that's been really interesting is seeing like these clashing responses to the LGBTQ community right now. Like, you'll see some states are passing like requiring LGBTQ history to be taught in schools. And then you see the exact opposite happening in other states where it's being banned.
Alabama. That's in that article I just posted. So Colorado, California, New Jersey require that you teach LGBTQ history. Alabama, it's against the law. And I didn't even know this. I guess it's against the law to be homosexual in Alabama. Like, you can't even.
Wow.
Yeah. Like,
Well, that's been overturned by the Supreme Court. So
thank God.
But it is illegal to say the word homosexual in school in Alabama.
So this article said, let me find where it says it. Some states even require teachers to speak about LGBTQ people in a negative light, according to GLEN, an education organization fighting for LGBTQ cultural inclusion and awareness in K through 12 schools. Alabama law, for example, states that when discussing sexual health education, classes must emphasize in a factual manner from a health perspective that homosexuality is not an acceptable lifestyle choice to the general public and that homosexual conduct is a criminal offense under the laws of the state.
Wait, they're forced to say that even though it's not enforceable because it's against the federal law? Wow, that's fun.
That's who were the
I love it. They emphasize that it's against the state law because they know that they can't enforce the law.
It's like where in the South when they used to teach that the Civil War was about states' rights. It wasn't about slavery.
They still do that shit.
Oh, yeah,
and now they do it in states that weren't.
Fucking crazy.
It's like there are several union states that now teach that the Civil War was about states' rights because they are now like overcome with right-wing people who think that.
Let's talk about unions for a second. Can we talk about the fact that in Alabama they were able to talk people out of forming a union in Amazon? Like, how the fuck do you do that?
I mean, you intimidate them.
Crazy.
And you make them think that unions are ineffective. There was a lot of really powerful propaganda against unions in Alabama. And honestly, that propaganda is throughout the country. I've been to a lot of places where like unions are still powerful and still respected by a majority of people, and people still spout that propaganda. And they'll be like, oh, well, if the union works for you, if I like say like, oh, that's really cool that like so-and-so place has a union.
One thing about even in like LGBTQ, the immediate go to when you talk about like sex education is, well, we shouldn't be teaching that stuff. What a lot of these people seem to forget is a lot of straight
Teaching that,
people
okay, but your
engage
parents don't know.
a lot of straight people engage in, like anal sex. That's not just for LGBTQ.
I watched Talking Out last night, and they were talking about specifically like talking to your kids about sex and how you basically you talk to your kids about sex in a language that they understand, and that like really resonated. I was like, that more people need to hear that. Like, don't like water it down. Don't sugarcoat it. Have those
Yep.
conversations. You know, you don't have to necessarily always baby your children. And then when they're as they progress through life and they get older and they understand more things, then you have more appropriate conversations. But
For sure.
Yeah, it's important to use the correct terms. Penis, vulva, vagina. Don't sugarcoat it and call it the cookie or, the twig and berries or anything like that.
The twig and berries, I'm dead.
Captain Winky.
The Tinky Winky.
We always want to call it cutesy stuff like the vajayjay or, the bedazzler.
Or the
there's so many different words. And it's like, just call it what it is.
You'd be surprised at like how mature children actually are when you treat them. You don't pander to them, I guess.
Pander isn't the right word.
What I don't know the word. I'm like when you don't
belittle them.
Yeah, when you belittle, like talking to them like babies. Like there's a time and place. Like when they're babies, talk to them like babies. But once they're like at a certain age, like you don't have to talk to your kids like babies anymore. You can talk to them like a normal, like you talk to anybody else.
Like unless they're an infant, you shouldn't be making cooing infant noises.
Right. And it's crazy. Like a lot of that shit still happens, and a lot of people like it. For a lot of, I feel like still today, a lot of kids, they're going to get sexually educated from porn and not from, their parents, or they're either going to get educated from porn or their peers and not their parents or a doctor.
Me is a lot of people like that parents are the ones to teach their kids about sex, but parents aren't educated about sex. Parents
a lot of times no, but I feel like the conversation is better had with adults than other kids or porn sites.
Oh, I agree.
Oh, yes.
That's not where I'm going. That's not where I'm going. So I also think that like kids should have those conversations with kids, but in an environment that is appropriate and set up to do so in a healthy way, that is guided, right? Like peers should have more control of the conversation than like an adult, so that it's like appropriate for them. But there are people who are sex educators, and they are educated in how to teach people, adults and children, about sex.
Let's have them be teachers in the school.
Exactly.
So it's not just like one class it's not just a 1 hour lecture that you're taking during your senior year. It's like an actual required course that you have to take early on in your education. Because that's all. Like we had to do sex education in my senior year of high school or my junior year of high school in health education, and it was one class. That was it. It was just one class, and that was the discussion. And it was specifically, it was basically the way the conversation was: don't have sex. Sex is bad. You'll get pregnant. You'll get STDs, and that's how they. And that's not going to work with teenagers. It's just not.
Especially with access to social media, TikTok, TV, they're going to learn those things and they're going to want to repeat those things.
Mm-hmm. And there's so many like good resources. Like there are states where that is not the case, right? So you look at like Massachusetts, people who are sex educators are sex educators. Like they teach sex ed. And in other countries, like sex ed is a K through 12 experience. And it's not like That is not, I am not saying that we teach 5-year-olds to have sex. We're teaching 5-year-olds information about their own bodies
Yeah.
so that they know what is and isn't appropriate for other people to do with their bodies. So they know how to act in public with their bodies. And so that they, I mean, one, so that they have proper hygiene, like that's important. And a lot of people don't know that,
Yep.
even adults. And so that kids have language to say if someone doesn't respect their bodily autonomy. And so that they can learn about love and families. And so when they get older, they learn, when they learn about sex, it's not as weird.
It's so
Because
weird.
they-
Our country is so fucking weird. Like on one hand, it's this taboo, and on the other hand, it's glorified all over television and media and music.
We act like kids don't see it. That's the thing
Yeah.
that drives me crazy. It's like
Or we
people
get
be like,
offended
"What do
when
you
kids
mean?
see it.
What do you mean? What do you mean that they're going to teach that in school?" I'm like, "Honey, have you not heard half the music on the radio? Have you not seen
Wow.
half the movies in this country? Like, kids are going to see this."
That was a huge deal after who was it? It was Megan Thee Stallion and Cardi B performed WAP. People
Yeah,
were
well,
up in arms
also
about
it's like
it.
you, like, if you really don't want your kid to see it, that's on you, honey. Like 100% that's on you. You should be monitoring what your child sees. But the reality is, like, kids have
But
to
can
be
it be monitored anymore? In
Mm,
like today's day and age, honestly, like I feel like we can try to censor, but I feel like it's impossible at this point. Because even like when you put like firewalls up and all this other shit, and you childproof your child's electronics, there's still ways around it.
there are.
And that's where it's important to always have an open discussion about those things, and
But that's
call,
why
like, correct terminology and stuff like that.
that's why sex education is so important.
Yeah, and
Because
it's
kids
got to
have to
start.
be given the tools to deal with the reality in which they live. Because we shouldn't be pretending it doesn't exist. But if someone really has a problem with that, that's on them. That is not on the rest of society. That's what I'm saying.
Would sex sell? Maybe this is like a big
On
like
them,
mind
because they're
fuck.
the one with the issue.
Maybe this is like a big mind fuck, and it's like reverse psychology, that like a giant marketing fucking scheme that's going on in our country where we make sex taboo so it sells.
Mm-hmm. Probably.
Yeah.
Because that's why it sells.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
like
forbidden.
So part of me wonders, like, do we really, like, do the corporations really want us to get rid of the taboo of sex?
Yeah.
Because if they do that, then it's not going to be, it's not
Well,
going to
some
sell.
of them do.
It's Apple that it's the you can't have it, so it's seductive. Like we want it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I'm shocked at how many, like, I can't remember who it was, that music artist. He didn't know about like the hymen and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And it was just
So
like,
many
that was
men
shocking
don't
how
know
many
what that
adults
is.
didn't know. The hymen does not break right after the first time having sex and it's gone. It's not like a wall that you push through and it's gone. And it's not just sex that can break a hymen, and a hymen can regrow, so it's.
Yeah, a
so
hymen
much
doesn't
information.
Hold on, give me 1 second. I'll be right back. Just give me 1 second.
But there's all kinds of elements to that, right? But I think it's really interesting too when you think about why do we not give kids access to LGBTQ information, right?
Yeah.
Like, why don't people know that Marsha P. Johnson was one of the leading people in Stonewall?
And Stonewall was so important to LGBTQ, and I'm shocked at how many people had no idea it even happened. Or
That was
don't
that
care.
educated me. I just recently found out about that.
Or like a lot of people won't talk about the fact that Pride was a riot, not not a protest, not a Wells Fargo float in a parade. It was a riot.
And let's not pretend anymore. This country was founded on people that fucking rioted and protested. That's what this country is fucking founded on.
Of
So
course,
fucking-
now let's also be real with that. This country was founded by rich white men who rioted
Right.
and protested
Yeah.
and riled up
Right.
other people to riot and protest.
That's true too. But let's not ostracize people that want to go out and protest and riot, because that's what this fucking country is fucking
Founded on.
We wouldn't be America had it not been for rioters, looters, protesters. Like, let's be fucking real.
Tea party, yeah, or
Yep.
where they threw the tea in the. I mean, that was pretty much a riot.
The
and
destruction of
looting.
property is not okay. I find so much irony.
You're not a patriot if you protest or you riot.
Yeah, but the ones that did it on January 6th were.
Oh, of course.
Because Trump said to.
Oh, but no! Don't you know that their new spin is that they didn't riot. They just peacefully protested, and a few people just broke some stuff, and most part the people were touring and staying in the little ropes and stuff. And what?
Bullshit. I saw pictures of that.
My favorite was when they tried to say that it was Antifa. Really, it was Antifa disguised as Trump supporters that were protesting. Like, no, dude.
That's so much effort.
The
Like,
thing is, if they're so convinced it was Antifa, wouldn't you want that investigated? Why do they not want it investigated if it was Antifa?
because they knew they would be criminally liable. Yeah. Oof. All I have to say is oof. Okay. Well.
Yeah. Well, it was a good conversation tonight. Next week we're going to actually go over LGBTQ history, and we will talk about Stonewall and kind of the history of LGBTQ. That we're going to have a full panel dedicated to that. We haven't had a whole lot of people sign up yet, but hopefully we get a few more people. So.
Yeah, if you want to come talk about it, let's talk about it. Why is Pride so important? Why this month?
I think today is actually the anniversary of the Stonewall, isn't it? Is it on the 18th?
Maybe.
Hold on. I know it's in like late June.
Wasn't it the 20?
The 28th.
The 28th? Okay.
Yeah.
So I got the year right. Okay.
Yeah. So, but that should be good. And then in a couple weeks, we're going to have a sex talk with kinks. We're going to particularly talk about kinks. So I think that's going to be a fun one.
So let me ask y'all something, because they were talking about rape culture on Talk It Out last night. So let me ask y'all something. A question that I had asked, and they told me no, it's just a kink. Is acting out a rape fantasy, does that support rape culture? Because I feel like it does. Because it's almost like a serial killer fantasizing about a serial kill. I feel like that's more than just a kink. But they disagreed with me. They said it's just a kink. I feel like a serial killer fantasizes about the kill before they actually go through it. I feel like if you're fantasizing and you're acting out this rape fantasy, I don't know. That's just how I feel about it.
I feel it's a double-edged thing where, you can keep it, if it's a particular kink and you're not doing it to people without, getting full consent.
I'm not talking about like domination and submission and that kind of kink. I'm talking about like actual rape fantasy, not being dominated or submitted.
There are people that they enjoy that, having somebody break into their home and rape them. Yes, there is a kink like that out there, but that is one thing you have to be extremely careful with. You have to make sure you have full consent. Definitely make sure you have the right address and things like that.
I
It's-
mean,
it's a
okay, that's
slippery-
so let's be very clear. What you're talking about is typically in that community called consensual non-consent play.
Yes.
It was not rape in that community.
Yeah, everybody's on board with it. It's not actual.
Yes.
I just feel like
right.
I feel like if that's your
However,
fantasy,
there
you're
are
playing with fire.
that a lot of people could say a lot of things like that about a lot of things. The slippery slope argument can go a lot of ways. I'm not saying an official statement on this, but it's not my kink, that's for sure. But
Nor me.
there is what people are talking about is having a scene in which they enact a non-consensual situation, all of which is discussed beforehand. Everything that's going to happen is discussed beforehand, and everything is consented to. And consent can be dropped within the moment
Always.
using code words.
Safe word.
Because
safe
there will
words
be
are-
safe words. Safe words are typically used in that kind of scenario because kind of the point of the scene is that you're like non-consent, so you have to make sure you have a specific word
Pineapple.
Pineapple.
like
Yep.
pineapple, because no one's going to say pineapple while they're having sex. And if they are, then that's not their safe word. You know? But there's so consent can be taken away in that moment as well, and that's key. Is that a risky situation for people to put themselves in if they don't trust or know the person well enough? Yes, because someone could say that they didn't know that consent was taken away.
Yeah.
Consent can be revoked at any point.
And that's scary.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I mean that's just a taste.
Well,
of
that's
what
why
we'll
I'm
talk
saying,
about
like,
with-
that's the whole thing. So
yeah, and we can talk about that more when we
that's the
talk
kind of
about
risk
kink.
I want to
Yeah,
put myself
yeah.
in. So yeah.
Little preview. Little preview.
Little
Also,
preview, little
warning.
taste. Because I definitely want to talk about like the 50 Shades and S&M and
Oh.
how those two are not the same.
The books or the movie? Or
The
both?
books in the movie is not legitimate S&M.
Okay, so I haven't read or seen the movies, but I sometimes like
it's pretty bad.
movies.
It's pretty bad.
Is it?
Oh my gosh, that's
Yeah.
right. I was like, am I just hot?
Like a lot of times like movies don't do a book justice, so I wasn't sure.
No, the
Oh
books
no, they're
were
both
terrible.
bad.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I
The
know
books
I
were
know
worse.
it was like softcore porn for moms, right?
Mm-mm. Mm-mm.
Really bad softcore porn.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a lot of issues with toxic relationships and consent in those books. So that, yeah, like I said, when we do the kink talk, we can talk more in depth of why that's problematic.
Okay.
But
All right.
I just want to thank y'all so much. I actually have some papers to work on, so I will talk to you later.
All right.
All
Thank you,
right.
Sam.
I think we can.
Yeah, I'm gonna start a group chat here in a little bit.
Yeah.
But thank you everybody for watching tonight. Thank you, Tammy, for coming on. And we will be back here next week to discuss Pride history and Pride. So
Nice.
see y'all next week.
Yeah.
See you next week.
Where's the goodbye overlay?